In this lecture, we're going to zoom in at how derived objects are built. And we're going to zoom in on the constructors that we have been ignoring on purpose so far. So here we have the inheritance hierarchy we will be using. It is what we are familiar with at this point. We have a person class, which is going to be our base class. We have an engineer class, which is now going to be doing public inheritance because we have seen enough of private inheritance. Our engineer class is now going to be nice and say, I am inheriting from person, but I also want my downstream classes to have access to the cool stuff I am getting from person. This is how our engineer class is behaving now. We are also going to have a civil engineer class, which is going to publicly inherit from engineer. But what we want to focus on here is what we get from base classes. So the engineer class is going to have a person part of it, but it is also going to build on top of that and add an engineer level and customize what kind of person it is. So if we inherit from engineer and build our civil engineer class, the first thing to be built by C++ is the person part of this. It is going to build an engineer level of this. And then we are going to add the civil engineer level to add the customizations that the civil engineer class is adding. And C++ is going to do this using constructors. By default, we are going to be using default constructors. If we don't specify a way for the base constructor to be called, C++ is going to call the default constructor to build your base objects. So if we set up something like this and try to run our program, we're going to get output like this. We're going to see that the person default constructor is going to be called first. And notice that we are building a civil engineer object. So the default constructor for the most base class is going to be called. Then we're going to be building an engineer layer on top of the person stuff that we get. Then we're going to build a civil engineer layer on top of the engineer stuff that we have already got. And the compiler is going to do this using the default constructors by default. So we're going to call the default constructor for person first. We're going to call the default constructor for engineer. And then we're going to call the default constructor for civil engineer to complete the construction of our object. The object will be complete at this point, and we will be able to use it later on in our program here. And hopefully this is going to drive the point home that you should really always provide default constructors for your classes. Because the compiler may call these default constructors in unexpected ways, especially if your class is part of an inheritance hierarchy. For example, if somebody tries to build the civil engineer object and you don't have a default constructor for person, the compiler is going to try and call that, and it's not going to find that, and it is going to throw a compiler error, as we are about to see in a minute. Okay, so the message really in this lecture is that the most base part of your class is going to be built. So for example, for our civil engineer class, we're going to build the person part first. Then we're going to build the engineer part, and then we're going to build the civil engineer part of that, and then we're going to finish the construction of our object. This is the message here. Now that you know this, we're going to head over to Visual Studio Code and play with this a little more. Here we are in our working folder. The current project is default argument constructor with inheritance. We are going to reuse the code from the last lecture because that's going to give us the classes that we need to play with what we want to do in this lecture, and that's playing with default constructors. Let's put in our starter code, and we're going to open this little guy in Visual Studio Code. Let's do this. So we're going to have our classes. We're going to have the main function, which we can play with. And we are going to look at the person class and make sure we have a default constructor. We are not going to default it this time because we want to have a body. We can put our output statements in. So in this case, we're going to go in the CPP file and put in a default constructor. We're going to say person and person and person here. And this is going to be our constructor. We're going to say stdcout default constructor for person called. Okay, so the person class is done. We have a default constructor that works as we want in. we're going to go to our engineer class and we're going to change it to do public inheritance. I think this is going to be much easier to deal with now. And we're going to remove all these resurrection we were doing here from the last lecture because this is no longer going to be needed. And what we really want is to look at our default constructor, which is really in here already. Let's look at the implementation. All we really need to do is put in stdc out and say default constructor for engineer called. And we're going to hop over to the civil engineer class and see if we have a default constructor, and we do have it. And we're going to go to the CPP file and say stdc out default constructor called for civil engineer. So this is going to basically do what we want, and what we really want to see is how, or the order in which our constructors are going to be called if we build a civil engineer object. As we have seen here, the person part is going to be built first. So this is going to call the constructor from person. And because we are not doing any kind of customization on which constructor is going to be called, the compiler is going to call the default constructor by default. So we're going to build the person part first, and we're going to see the default constructor for person called. After that, we're going to build the engineer part of us, and this is going to call the default constructor for engineer. And after that, we're going to build the civil engineer part of us, and that's going to call the civil engineer default constructor. This is what we want to see if we build a civil engineer object. So we are going to hop over in the main CPP file and actually build the civil engineer object. We're going to say civil engineer, and we're going to say CE1. We can do that. And we're going to see what happens. Let's try and build this program. We're going to build that with GCC. The build is going to be good. We can run it. Let's bring up a PowerShell window we can play with. We want to bring up a PowerShell window we can clear and run Rooster. And you're going to see that default constructor for person called, default constructor for engineer called, default constructor for engineer called. This is what we want to see, and hopefully this proves that the compiler is really going to build our civil engineer object in parts. The compiler is going to see that it is a derived object, and it's going to see all the classes that this is deriving from. So it is going to build the most base part first. After that, it is going to build other layers until it reaches the level where we are at this civil engineer objects. Again, if we put another statement out here, we're going to say hello in here, and we're going to say std out. And I am doing this so that I just have a point where I can put my breakpoint. Some IDEs are not going to like it if you put a breakpoint at an empty line. So that's why I am doing it here. And I am going to try and debug and really show you that we have an engineer and a person part in us. I have shown you this before, but it doesn't really hurt to repeat this because debugging is really cool. It's going to give you more information than you could ever ask for. We're going to hit our breakpoint here, and if we look in our locals, we're going to have our civil engineer object, which is in scope now. And you see that we have an engineer part of us, and the engineer has a person part in it. So what the compiler is really going to do when it is building a civil engineer object, it is going to build the most base part of us. So it is going to build the person part. After that, it is going to build an engineer layer on top of that. And then it is going to build the civil engineer layer. And that's what we see in our output when we get to run our program here. If we go back, we're going to see that we still have our binary. We can still run it. Let's bring up a terminal window we can use to run this. We're going to run Rooster, and we're going to see the order in which our constructors are called. And this is really cool. Now that we have just debugged this program, we can take out this hello line because it's really useless. And this is really what I wanted you to see. Constructors are going to be called in your inheritance hierarchy, starting from the most basic, going down to the most specialized one. So we're going to call the most base constructor, which is person, and we're going to keep going until we reach the most specialized, which is civil engineer here. to build our object. And our object is really going to be built up in layers. This is the message I am trying to convey here. This is really all I had to share in this lecture. I hope you found it interesting. We are going to stop here in this one. In the next one, we're going to see that we can actually actively call a base class constructor from our derived class, and that's going to add much more flexibility in how our objects are built. We are not going to call the default constructor. We're going to be calling our own constructors and have much more control on how our derived objects are set up and built. Go ahead and finish up here and meet me in the next lecture.